Mine's a little off. Oh, well.
It was about as good as last time. So as long as I can see the big line, then we can head that direction.
Okay, good.
All right. Hello, listener. You are listening to The Pill Pod, the only anti-Applebee's podcast on the internet, where you can hang with us and dose yourself on critical theory, philosophy, and whatever other eccentricities come up. The Pill Pod are a bunch of doctors or almost doctors of philosophy, midwives of the soul, some may call us. Anyway, we're kicking back with some beers.
Whoa, you didn't tell me that was happening.
Oh, well, you missed out. Books. And we're going to discuss, what's the theme today? Conspiracy theory.
Indeed.
Today, you have the regular four of us, as well as guest Matthew McManus.
What's up?
Matthew McManus is one of the most productive people, judging by his Facebook. Because...
And Twitter.
You know what's interesting about Matt is he's the most charitable guy you've ever seen dealing with the most absurd arguments on Facebook, let alone Twitter. But if you judge by his Facebook, he's willing to have a 3-hour argument with a Zionist.
Yeah.
And the Zionist, you know, has a picture of himself at some tourist site and his wife is next to him looking very scared.
Excellent.
What Zionist did you debate with for 3 hours?
Oh, it's some person I knew from back in my undergraduate degree. We've never actually spoken in person more than once or twice, but for some odd reason, he has this interest in what I'm doing, and he's been arguing with me for years and years and years now.
Oh, really?
I don't know if there's a word for this, but it's an anti-fan. It's the person who's just sitting urgently waiting for the notification that Matt has posted something, and then as soon as he does, he'll verbally assault him.
Troll.
There's a few of them now, actually.
Yeah,
It's
I feel like you have a lot of those.
It's like I have like professional trolls. Yeah. I don't know if I have any fans. I definitely have trolls who are like active and commenting on whatever the fuck I'm doing at any moment.
Yeah,
so
pretty solid troll base you can always expect.
I would say that's true. I mean, basically, I have a bunch of different conspiracies on why it is that these people are interested in doing this. Some of them I think are just trying to annoy me, but other people I think get a sense of vindication from these kind of disputes, especially because some of the people who comment on my Facebook are reasonably like intellectually savvy, right? People like you, other PhDs, and I think being included in that group gives them a sense of accomplishment at the very least.
So just for the sake of our listeners, Matt McManus is an academic and an author. His main arena is postmodern conservatism, where he accuses conservatives of doing the things that they accuse the left of doing, mainly invoking conservatism and a lack of universal truth and so on. Matt, do you want to say anything else about that?
Sure. Well, the basis of my argument, and you are all familiar with it, right, is that postmodern culture isn't necessarily something that just sprung from the pens of a couple of eccentric French authors in the 1960s. You know, it's a cultural condition that's generated by a lot of profound transformations that have been going on in our society for the last couple centuries, really. And since it's a cultural condition, you shouldn't just expect that there's going to be a postmodern left politics. You expect it to be much more ubiquitous than that. My argument is that people like Trump or Viktor Orban or Jair Bolsonaro in Brazil are the products of postmodern culture, hence what I call postmodern conservatives.
You could call it a conspiracy theory, which is the reason that we invited him on today. So to kick this off, we have usually based our discussions on this podcast around a specific reading. We're trying something different today in basing it around a topic, because we all have our own areas of expertise in our degrees and our areas of study. So my thought in introducing a topic rather than a reading was we could all bring our own sort of interests to the discussion and argue about what a conspiracy theory is that way. So the first thing that I wanted to bring up was that I think a conspiracy theory is a semiotic, that is sign-based structure Conspiracy theories give the entire world a meaning. They sort of index every different aspect of the world, and particularly media events, into a sort of structure. And I'm going to argue that this structure is actually coherent. It doesn't make sense to say that conspiracy theories are false, or at least that's not the way that you should argue against them. Because simply by arguing that it's false, you're going to be falling into the indexes of their conspiracy theory that says, you're on the sides of the elites or whatever. And it forms a coherent worldview.
Are we on the sides of the elites?
No, the opponents to your rebuttal to their theory, then they will say, oh, you've just been brainwashed by the elites, which is why you're accepting.
Yeah, I've been called a sheeple for believing that COVID is real. So yeah.
And it's worth mentioning, like, kind of the angle on the conspiracy theory topic too is like in the context of COVID-19, of course, right? Because there's a lot of them these days.
And I think that's the reason that we chose to do that today is the conspiracy theory is surrounding COVID. I mean, variously, either that COVID was created by some malicious agent or that the government is trying to use COVID as a means of taking over the control of people's individual freedoms. And I want to first, before anyone else says anything, reference this back to Bruno Latour, who we discussed earlier on the podcast of the first two episodes. And he basically says that critical theory bears exactly the same structure as conspiracy theory. So we can both defend critical theory, which is something that we're all engaged in, at the same time as distancing ourselves from these local views of the world or paradigms for interpreting the world.
And clearly he has a very particular way he wants critical theory to be done. And so it's more so resembles conspiracy theory when it's not done right.
Eric, do you want to elaborate, first of all, just on what he's saying when he claims that critical theory bears resemblance to a conspiracy theory?
Yes.
You can pause as long as you want.
Sorry, I'm getting some audio difficulties here. Yeah. Well, Bruno Latour's argument against critical theory is essentially that when people look at the world in terms of what he calls the modernist settlement, which is basically this cultural phenomenon in which we hold opposing concepts, contradictory concepts, together, but we find a way to resolve that conflict and look at the world through this lens of these contradictory concepts at the same time. So you have things like subject, object, nature, culture, and usually the moves in your argument are to be like, oh, well, your view of the world is dominated by ideology. So listen to me, because I have the real picture of what is going on in the world. And then the next argument is that when somebody thinks they do see the world clearly, they just say, oh, you're not seeing things clearly. I mean, it's a complex argument, but basically conspiracy theory has the same general structure as badly done critical theory.
So just to summarize, you could say it's something like you're interpreting this phenomena, and this phenomena is a sign for something bigger going on behind the scenes. Would that make sense to say?
Sure. Yeah. You project, I mean, the conspiracy theory thing is you project some kind of unity or some kind of agency onto negative things that are happening in the world. And either it's a result of the government or some other organization behind the scenes. And honestly, a lot of critical theory looks like that too. You have Foucault talking about power, for instance. That can be construed as a conspiracy theory.
Or even what Agamben was talking about the last couple episodes.
Yeah. Maybe we'll get into some kind of leftist conspiracy theory, but I think generally we'll be restricted to the right. but
That's
not
true.
necessarily.
Oh. You can even talk about something like media theory, right? Manufacturing consent and the idea that the media are all part of some elite organization that are ultimately but unconsciously putting a conformist agenda on the broader population.
Yeah.
Exactly.
Just for the sake of giving concrete examples, and I don't want to be disparaging any of these disciplines, but the easiest way to break it down would be to say something like the different branches of critical theory. So neo-Marxism projects this enemy called capitalism, and they attribute a number of malicious things that happen in the world to capitalism. Or feminism would call it the patriarchy, or I don't know, gender studies would call it heteronormativity. So they're axioms against which you posit your own research and your own views as this normative status quo that you are standing in opposition to. And I don't think Bruno Latour called out any of those things specifically. I'm only trying to provide a map here for the kinds of things that he might be talking about. So it's the big bad enemy that's behind every local thing that you interpret.
I wonder to what extent that definition also maps onto like populism, because the way you were describing that reminds me a lot of like sort of textbook definitions of populism, where you have like, it's like there's an oppositional structure, right? Where you have like the fake people who are trying to get in your way of like the truth or the authentic potential in the population. And then, of course, you have like the real people that this populist leader is trying to fight for. And there's maybe some sort of inherently built-in conspiratorial thinking into populist thinking. I wonder if you guys would agree.
They follow the same structure for sure. The same method of argument is often used to support your beliefs in conspiracy theory, right? It's
or conspiracy theories are like a vehicle that, or like a kind of, like a tactic for populism, maybe.
I think that's true. I think that what distinguishes populist conspiracy theorizing from the more standard variants that we see is the fact that populist conspiracy theorizing is heavily overdetermined from a psychological standpoint. And so you see more extreme iterations of the similar dynamic that you were talking about. That's where I think it's a bit different. But fundamentally, I think that, it's pretty similar.
Yeah. Yeah. And Latour emphasizes the speed at which conspiracy theories are emerging today after the event, right? I mean, you have a major event that Latour refers to as 9/11. We're going to talk maybe a bit about COVID, but it's really the dust of the event has barely settled before a multiplicity of conspiracy theories emerge, and they all purport to explain exactly what is really going on, right? There's this kind of link to this sort of truther kind of tendency behind it, is to say this is what it looks like is happening, but this is what's really going on. And if you know what I know, then you can get by a little bit better in the world.
It's not just if you know what I know, it's if you just make the right connections, which we can all do. And that's what the conspiracy theorist is telling us, that this knowledge is available to everyone. And it's based on how many different things come into play that cannot possibly be coincidence, cannot be accidental, and always have some lurking, I'm going to use the term other, behind the scenes that is controlling everything and pulling strings.
Yeah. I mean, the way that I understand this and is that a conspiracy theorist, and I'll jump off what you were saying here, Eric, because I think it's broadly correct, is ultimately like a kind of pseudo-optimist rationalist, right? Where everything in the world is super saturated with meaning. The mind can comprehend it. And all we need to do is untangle the human barriers to our understanding imposed by power, and the universe will become fully comprehensible. And this is ultimately a very optimistic view in my standpoint, because there's this belief that anything that goes on in the world is ultimately the result of some human power that's pulling the strings. And all we need to do, of course...
Or a reptile alien.
Or the reptile aliens, some conscious being. The sense that the universe is ultimately catastrophic in and of itself, and sometimes bad things just happen, isn't something that can really be incorporated into the conspiracy theorist worldview, because of course if things just happen, that means nobody's actually willing them to be. They just occur because of nature, which is inherently non-anthropic, and therefore are inherently beyond our control, or at least beyond our full control.
Right. And COVID's the perfect example of that, right? Because they don't want to accept that it just happened, that just this virus emerged in whatever, a wet market in China or who knows where, and it's just blind luck that it mutated and jumped to humans. And like, that's something that they don't want to accept.
I'm kind of wondering, if like Times Person of the Year will be like, man who ate bat in Wuhan market,
Yeah.
I mean,
so the point of this is that we can invoke our patron of this podcast, Dr. Jordan B. Peterson. It's an antidote to chaos. So we have this structure, and even if the actors in our narrative are malicious, at least they make sense of the world for us. But I want to jump to a word that I think will get us pretty far in this discussion, that Matt said a little while ago, which is over-determining. So over-determining has to do with causation. And conspiracy theory is fundamentally about over-determining phenomena, which is ascribing too much agency to a particular origin or intention behind an event that occurs. So whatever event it is, it really doesn't matter. They're usually media events, but moon landing, 9/11, COVID most recently, and about over-determining the causes that go into that. My question to the crowd then is, what is being overdetermined, and would there be a correct way to interpret these events without overdetermining it, considering the fact that in our lives, just our existential day-to-day watching TV, looking at the internet lives, we have to deal with so much information? Because my perspective on this is conspiracy theories make sense in a very literal interpretation of that sentence. They make sense of an extremely complicated world by overdetermining anything that looks random as something intentional.
Yeah, I mean, I'll talk about my favorite filmmaker, Dinesh D'Souza, and his latest movies, Hillary's America, Donald Trump, and his new stuff about the nation. Because one of the things that's interesting is exactly how he overdetermines the significance of the Democratic Party and the significance it's played in apparently leading to this decline of American power and real Americans over the last 40 or 50 years. And it's this extraordinarily simplistic narrative, right? That any kind of problems that you, speaking to the quote, real people, detect in your society right now, it's the fault of the Democratic Party. And most of us would look at the Democratic Party today and say, this is one of the most poorly run political institutions in the world. They don't seem to know what they're doing. What the hell are they thinking? And as probably the more literal truth. And the same is to a certain extent true of the Republican Party. But by over-determining this one political party and streamlining this very simplistic narrative about decline into one where these malicious actors are responsible for all the bad things that have happened to you, it allows people to retreat from the complexity of the world into the cinema where there's an antagonist and themselves who are ultimately the protagonist in the story to rebuild the nation from the ground up. That's my thought about it, at least. Or at least one example.
And we can reconnect this to what Alex, who is psychoanalysis guy, just said. This is all about creating an other and even over determining an other from which you can get your identity, right?
I think this gives us a really clear and almost too easy example about how when we're talking about the other, and when Lacan introduced the object petit a and the small other and the big other, they're so interrelated, they almost cannot be discussed without each other. And so when he talks about the small other, he's talking about that fundamental fantasy that is, I mean, imagine how when like we have desire for like even like an image of another, that image is internal to our psyche. We could say that, the cause of desire, the fundamental fantasy of the conspiracy theory has an inextricable relation to both law and the body and it posits another that is so imaginary that it doesn't even have an image attached to it, unless we're talking about, lab coats, big pharma, and lizard people. And so we have all these images come to mind that are just so phantasmatic. But I think the relation to law is crucial. We could think of conspiracy theories in terms of, I think there once would have been a time where talking about all the phenomena that resulted in the Me Too movement would have been like, okay, there's no way that's all true. That's a conspiracy theory. But hey, we could really investigate these things and say, okay, there's some really horrible things going on, totally institutionalized, and really look into them. But what makes a conspiracy theory different is it's just totally powers of the imagination. It's like literature that posits itself as real. It's phantasmatic, and it's internal to the psyche of the subject, who is looking for other people to validate that fantasy.
Although doesn't it depend somewhat on like taking something verifiable and then like extending it beyond like reasonableness of conclusions? And I think like one other link I'd like to add on to that is related to what Matt was talking about, which is the way in which conspiracy theories, right? It's like about wanting to avoid, it's like an optimistic, I really like that, by the way, that it's like, that there's like an optimism to it built into conspiracy theories. And I think you could connect this to the psychoanalytic point, because in some ways, like what is the subject trying to do with a conspiracy theory? But I think like in a way, attempting to avoid like the real of this kind of just the blind, like the fact that things just happen. And like, it's like in some ways conspiracy theories. Maybe you'll disagree.
This is why I love the Pill Pod, because there's a theory of conspiracy theory emerging just out of this discussion while we bounce off of each other. So to push this a little bit further, dealing with all these events, and we have these overdetermined signs, whatever they are in context, COVID is an event created by 5G to bring about some Malthusian population control, or whatever the theory is. But we get these overdetermined signs, and then we get enclosed universes of conversation. So if you deny the conspiracy theory to a conspiracy theorist, then you are taking the side of the elites against them. So the other that remains part of the narrative, and the other from which you're gaining your own identity. And I like what you said, Alex, that it's almost a too easy example of this occurring.
Now, what I like to look at, though, is how psychoanalysis is looking at unconscious laws. The superego is often thought to be made up of laws, and we can't emphasize enough how these are often unspoken laws. I think a way to look at this in terms of conspiracy theories is not just unconscious laws, but the structure of law. Our fundamental fantasy is a relation to the structure of law. And it's very bodily. We're being told what to do with our bodies. We're being very much...
I think we lost him.
Oh, he's lost to COVID. He knows too much, and I think they sent someone over to his house to take him out, probably from the Gates Foundation.
The COVIDs took him out.
The Bill and Melinda's.
They're based on anxieties about the body, but they're based on structures of law as well. Being told what to do, being told what to put in our bodies, being told what bodies to be frightful of. And so this is a way of looking at how our fundamental fantasy is related to the big other. And so it posits a brand new big other that doesn't even exist. I mean, we can't find these people pulling the strings that are creating COVID as either a hoax or that are using it for their advantages, that are using cell towers to control our bodies or our minds. It all has to be posited as some other that is beyond the law. It gives us a new entitled relation to the law, and that's where identity comes into it.
But if you're going to take Lacan seriously, that's not that's not a conspiracy theory that does that. That's just the way we have to function in order to relate to others in the first place. So is our life a conspiracy theory? Could you say that?
No, but we can. He did say very clearly, and he's very rarely clear. He said very clearly that the paranoiac has fantasies that follow the same structure as the neurotic's fantasies. So we are all doing this regularly. We are all positing an idea of what the other wants from us. We all have fantasies that we impose on the external world. So to an extent, it follows the same structure. And I think this gets us to the crux.
Wait, did he cut out again?
Yeah, he cut out again. I think his internet connection's really shitty.
It's a dramatic pause.
All right. So to move on from this dramatic pause, we have now dealt with conspiracy theory in the politics and conspiracy theory in psychoanalysis. So I want to move to our last guy that we haven't dealt with, Eric, who is Semiotic's guy. What would conspiracy theory look like if you analyze it from a semiotic perspective? So I'll just give you a jumping point here. A semiotic structure, it studies signs and references, and a lot of semiotics is trying to determine whether or not words represent reality or not, quote unquote. But in the case of conspiracy theory, the whole system is like self-referential. So whether or not the conspiracy theory turns out to be true doesn't really matter. So as far as the semiotic system is concerned, everything that counts as relevant as a sign refers to another part of that system. So Eric, as Semiotic's guy, how would you interpret a conspiracy theory and a sign like the event of COVID as a semiotic structure?
I mean, I guess I'll just start by saying that, I mean, there's a couple different reasons that a bunch of people would come together who don't really believe in conspiracy theories to come together to talk about them. Because why would we want to talk about conspiracy theories? I mean, on the one hand, many of them are completely innocuous. They are not very harmful, and others not so much. I mean, we've seen people burning 5G towers as a result of the beliefs that it's causing COVID, or it's
trying
some
to break into Applebee's,
some kind of plan to manage the population in some other way.
Sorry, my computer just ran out of battery and then stopped, so I had to get the charger again. My bad.
Eric's in the middle of a point.
Oh, sorry.
Well, I mean, I'm just thinking about why, like, before we get to the semiotic perspective, it's good to think about why would we want to even talk about what's the point of engaging with people who believe in conspiracy theories? Because on the one hand, some of them are pretty innocuous, and on the other hand, some of them can actually be quite dangerous and have negative effects, especially in places where people don't have access to the sorts of information that we have access to, right? I mean, I remember when I was first saw the sort of 5G conspiracies linked to the emergence of COVID, and I thought immediately that this is just bullshit. Like I feel like I can spot a conspiracy theory when I see one, and lo and behold, the 5G conspiracy theory, right? So from the semiotic perspective that I look at, I mean, the answer to like any conspiracy theory, I guess it depends on the conspiracy, because when we're trying to look at something like COVID, right, that's a natural phenomenon, and but it is largely a result of human activity, and something like 9/11 is more of a social phenomenon, we could safely say, and it has more to do with the geopolitical landscape of the planet, right? So from a semiotic perspective, those distinctions are going to be important. So it's not so easy to just sort of talk about the general structure of a conspiracy from a semiotic perspective, because you have to know what the event, how are we characterizing the event that the conspiracy theories are purporting to explain in the first place? That's one important thing to establish. So something like COVID, right? The truth behind the event is that we have to wait because we don't know what it is. We don't know what it's going to do. We don't know what the future is going to hold for COVID. So right now, the conspiracy theories are that you already described them the best way. It's a closed self-referential universe that has less to do with the actual event and more to do with the people involved, the people who are looking for answers, the people who have existential difficulties and they're looking for some sort of affirmation, or they're looking to be a part of some kind of social group and repeating these conspiracy theories and learning about them as a way to feel like you're a part of something. And so in a way, they have nothing to do with the event themselves. So it's a little difficult. I'd have to think about a little more about it in terms of COVID specifically, if we want to get into that more as the podcast goes on.
Well, one thing that I want to bring back, though, is the conspiracy theories that we watch never have to do with particular events that, happen on your lawn. They're always about the broadest sort of media events. The moon landing, where everyone's glued to their TV watching, I don't know, Neil Armstrong do whatever, or 9/11, where everyone's glued to their TV watching the towers collapse. So I would say that the sign is not actually the event itself. The sign is the media event. And this is me bringing in Baudrillard. The conspiracy theory is there's more that meets the eye, especially in terms of the way that the media reports on it. Because the conspiracy theorist is the least likely person to trust the media is reporting on an event.
Right. I'm tempted to say
so much on it too.
Along those lines that yes, what the conspiracy theories are designed to meet is not the event itself, but more like an image, right? Because what the media does
Might we say a simulation?
Sure. Yeah, we could say that. We could say that it is a simulacrum. I mean, I'm not in that tradition of semiotics, but we don't need to go into that. But really what the media does is it constructs an image for you, right? The moon landing, people have a very visual imagistic sense of that. Same with, the Twin Towers collapsing. Those of us who are old enough to remember it have a very specific sort of image in our minds of what happened. And now COVID has an image, right? We have those little what viruses look like. Those are paraded around online. All this. So they're meant to meet the image and not really the reality behind the image. Because especially in terms of COVID, that's going to be the job of scientists to study and figure out what the hell's going on there. But really what it meets is the simulacrum, the media constructed image that then begins to circulate that people then connect in various ways. And that's what indexing something can mean in that sense, is that the reference of this. I mean, you see the same sort of conspiracy pop up for each thing, right? Say 9/11, COVID, whatever you want. There's either some kind of CIA plot, liberal elites. I mean, each time the structure is the same, but they're connected to different images. So that's how they're indexed. Like those explanations are ready there in the background, in the sense those are the things doing the overdetermining. And then what is being overdetermined is the event, the image, the simulacrum itself, because it just becomes fodder for further unfolding this worldview rather than actually explaining anything that's going on in the world in any genuine kind of way, right?
In a literal and figurative way, this is do not believe your eyes. And I think we should unpack this further, maybe later on down the road, but it's very much a visual phenomenon because they look at a picture of the Earth from the moon and say, look, there's like artifacts in the JPEG image that show that this was probably photoshopped, even though it was like taken in 1960. or whatever. So it's do not believe your eyes.
Right. And in the semiotic tradition, again, I mean, not in the one I'm working from. Symbol has a very different meaning in the one I'm working in. But when I'm saying image, I'm also talking about a symbol. Because what a symbol generally is the meaning is assigned to a symbol, right? It's a convention. It's understood to be true. Therefore, that's the reference of the symbol. So when you can take whatever image you want, the tower's falling down. So that becomes a symbol for various explanations then. And those explanations are the point. It's not the event itself being explained. It's the explanation that's the point. And so the same goes for things like dog whistles, right? When we talk about, oh, that word is a alt-right dog whistle, right? That's because the word itself, whatever the word is meaning or explaining in its original sense, doesn't matter, because it's the symbol, and the symbol is a conventional thing that people assign meaning to. They grow, they gain meaning, they change meaning. And so when I say image, I'm sort of meaning the same thing. And Lacan is very much in that tradition where symbol means what is agreed in the community that uses that symbol.
And this is where critical theory, what most of us do, all of us are inspired by at least, and conspiracy theory are cousins, because there's always more referenced by the sign that can't be seen by the untrained eye until your eye is trained. So when people say capitalism does this or that, it's a conspiracy theory, because it's applying a lot of volition to these unintentional forces. Capitalism is not this giant lizard behind the scenes. So we could have a long discussion about what counts as intention or not, but whether it's elites, politicians, the media, or some other sort of power relations, this conspiracy instinct, as well, I think, as the critical instinct, is that you shouldn't trust the narrative that you're given, because there's always more that meets the eye. So the narrative is sort of a system of signs that points to some outside intention or other intention.
Well, this is actually a point where I'd like to talk about Baudrillard, because I think Baudrillard makes a very subtle point on this instance. People have been actually oversaturating various objects and various symbols with meaning for many centuries, right? You can think of transubstantiation in the Catholic tradition, where a piece of bread wasn't just a piece of bread. It was meant to be the body of literal God there in the room, which you consume, and therefore transcend your earthly coil and become a part of God, right? And what I think we see with people who look at images on TV in this hyper-real medium is something very similar to what dogmatists would see when they're approaching the subject of transubstantiation. It can't just even be this image, because most of us are savvy right now to distrust what we're shown. There has to be some deeper significance behind the image, this real thing that overdetermines everything that's going on, and that provides what I'm seeing right now with meaning and significance beyond just the mundane images and sounds that I'm encountering. And I think this is fundamentally not a critical attitude. It looks critical because it's skeptical of the fact that this image is all that there is, but it's not, because what it wants is for this meaning to be, there to be more meaning to this image going beyond it. And what a truly critical disposition does is wean you off of this need to find significance in the things around you, and to force yourself to ask more critically what it is that you think is important in life.
And I think adding to that, we could also say being critical is about accepting indeterminacy instead of over-determination, right? Instead of always needing to show the exact determined symbolic value of the words and images were presented and say, no, this is the real truth behind them. Part of being critical, I think, is showing that we can never say the whole truth about a narrative. That is indeterminate.
Right, it's always
I think
incomplete.
of Lacan's injunction at this point, right? Like Lacan famously inverted Dostoevsky's famous injunction, right? That without God, everything is permitted, right? And Lacan said, no, without God, nothing is permitted, right? There's no one who's authorizing your action and giving it a significance that goes beyond.
Yeah, he
itself.
says nothing is permitted anymore. Yeah, he's taking that from St. Paul, actually.
Yeah, exactly. And like what I think, we're seeing in these kind of circumstances, right, as a conspiracy theorist is somebody who has to have some kind of authorization for their actions and for their beliefs. It goes beyond what they're presented conventionally, but it still is transcendent in the sense of never arising from their self and their own critical analyses of the world.
All right, so I like this because at least
that.
we're drawing a differentiation between critical theory and conspiracy theory. You can't really use the words true or false to deal with either one of these things. It's rather more of a case of like, what is determining what? Because conspiracy theories are coherent. And then good theories, is what I hear you guys saying, good theories of any kind should be able to account for new evidence.
Yeah. So when you recognize that truth is partially subjective, you should always be looking for more instead of closing yourself off.
Absolutely. I mean, it's interesting when you're saying that because I'm thinking back to like Agamben's COVID-19 antics. And like, I wonder if some of what he says falls into like the conspiracy in the sense that it seems like he's not, like one of the mistakes he's making is he's not just like taking the world in, like information in. He already has this framework that he wants to explain it with. And I wonder if there's some parallel. Well, I agree that critical theory is not the same as conspiracy theories, of course, but I just like wonder whether, at least in this case, Agamben is maybe somehow falling into this kind of vulnerability, like it, like kind of determining a kind of like infusing what's happening in like the governmental measures of like against COVID with a kind of significance that maybe isn't there, right? That it's like about control and it's about these things. I don't know what you guys think about that.
Yeah. I mean, I'd like to go back to the origins of critical theory with Socrates, right? And say that the first thing that's important in being a critical theorist or a critical person generally, rather than being a conspiracy theorist, is dispositional, right? It's an attitude you take even towards your own ideas and your own theoretical propositions, which is something Socrates was always able to do. And I think what we're seeing here with Agamben is somebody who developed this very rich and interesting framework, but it's now become slightly dogmatic. It's something that he applies rotely to every kind of situation without interrogating its foundations or its applicability based on different kinds of evidence, right? And I think that demonstrates that dispositionally, he's not really adopting a critical standpoint any longer, at least in the sense that I would think is most important, going back to this kind of Socratic orientation.
I agree with that.
So could we say in this perspective then that both conspiracy theory and critical theory create semiotic universes, but some are large and some are small, and we're kind of coming out on the side of large universes that are willing to interpret new information, and people, characters, events, they all come to signify this new universe. So the us versus them, if it's small, it's not good. If it's truth versus lie, which would be Plato's interpretation of this, or inside versus outside, self versus other, whatever it is. But I'd be interested to hear Alex's perspective on this, because this is precisely Deleuze's critique of psychoanalysis, saying it's making a small universe.
Yeah. So when Deleuze has so many even performative critiques of psychoanalysis. And so especially, I mean, I guess the typical one to go to would be the Oedipalizing nature of psychoanalysis, that by constantly telling us to question ourselves, you know, it's putting us in a very specific position that it wants to further its own goals, which we should be aware of. So when you bring up Deleuze, I mean, so what do you think Deleuze would say about, you know, the way we're trying to formulate what conspiracy theory is and how we should look at it? Like, how would he critique our current discussion right now, you think?
I don't think he'd critique it. He, like all of schizophrenia and capitalism, is saying the schizophrenic has a better view of capitalism than the rest of us do because we're unable to see past it. The schizophrenic is at least able to pull up these worlds from other places, from ground zero, in order to interpret the world in a new way. Whereas psychoanalysis is just reinterpreting the state by saying everything is mommy daddy politics.
Yeah, and I think this could bring us back to something I think we've discussed in previous episodes, which is like when we're constantly saying, oh, you should be questioning your desire. It kind of gives the analyst the privileged position of seeming like they aren't also coming from a place of desire. We should recognize we are as well, and that when we are, critiquing theories and trying to decide what is critical theory and what is not, we are still positioned in terms of fantasy somehow. But I still think nonetheless, this is a way of saying, hey, we are all coming from a place of fantasy. And it gives us a way of, I think, opening up dialogue. When we're talking about like discourse in terms of large and small, and we could bring in open and closed, the more we recognize the phantasmatic element, the more we can look at what is presented to us in the media and whatnot, and at least say, okay, maybe they're making mistakes in their own subjective nature as creatures of desire and fantasy, people who are trying to present narratives to us. Instead of jumping on mistakes or jumping on it and saying, hey, this is entirely lies presented by this other that I know about and nobody else does, and you should accept what I'm saying about it. At least it gives us a way to, recognize we're dealing with something that is very hard to pin down and very unpredictable. And I think this is the stance we should be taking.
That's cheesy.
I would actually like here to kind of make a different point, which is to insist on the psychoanalytic character of the neurotic in juxtaposition to the schizoid or the schizopersonality in Deleuze and Guattari's theory. Because it seems to me like the schizoid personality in Deleuze and Guattari is somebody who's really open to contingency in this extraordinarily radical way, operating from the standpoint of this kind of Bergsonian approach to time, whereas the neurotic is somebody who is trying to avoid contingency at all costs by, as we've all been pointing out, over-determining the causes of their existence and all the things that happen to them. And so they're precisely somebody who's very hostile to the idea of contingency operating in their life and is even willing to project various conspiratorial powers that are operating in order to explain whatever it is that's happening to them. I'm not sure what people think about that.
Deleuze and Guattari never discussed conspiracy theory specifically that I can recall. But what's interesting, what would be an interesting question here is whether the schizoid or the neurotic is more likely to form a conspiracy theory. Because the schizoid just believes, kind of everything to the point of your mind is so open that it falls out of the back of your head. Whereas the neurotic is so desperate to project some sort of control on becoming that it can't project, that they're going to also make a conspiracy theory. So I think it's interesting that you just bust out the schizoid to this point, because I don't know what Deleuze would have to say about conspiracy theories beyond the fact that they're actually nomadic and actually departing from state philosophy and state structure.
Well, I think probably say they're just another neurotic that should be more schizoid, right?
Yeah, that's my feeling, right? You'd say that, this can resemble the ideas, resemble the schizoid personality, but because they're so hostile to contingency, it's not quite the same, right?
I'm sure Deleuze would have liked conspiracy theories when he first encountered them, because he would see them as lines of flight that resist capture by institutionalized systems. And then he would grow, as he did, to hate it eventually, as he does to everything, because they would no longer be these free nomadic rhizomatic spreading. They would now be predicted and captured by institutional forces and arranged into this sort of orderly, what does he call them? This sort of consistent way of grabbing people's minds and funneling their flows and their potencies into these systems of capture. So you can see that. I mean, you can see, for instance, Republican politicians leaning into conspiracy theory now because they know that they're going to come out. They know that that some whack job somewhere is going to come out with this conspiracy about what's going on. And so they just get ahead of the curve now and blame China right away. Cause why not? We don't have to come up with any genuine analysis. We can just rely on the neurotics to come forward. The neurotics who were trailblazers 20 years ago are now just captured by my,
Yeah. I mean, if you think about somebody like Alex Jones, he's kind of pedestrian at this point, right? He has his talking points and he continuously comes back to them. Trump is almost always ahead of him because he's got a new conspiracy theory every week. If I was Alex Jones, I'd be like, I can't fucking keep up with you, right? Like, you've got to tone it down a little bit. Is it the Chinese? Is it liberal elites? Is it universities? How's it all?
Yeah, like when Kennedy was murdered, I'm sure everyone was so amped up on, wow, it was an inside job and it was all planned. And then 9/11 happens and then they come out the same shit. Oh, it was an inside job. It was planned from the start. And by then everyone's like, I'm tired of hearing this fucking theory about everything because it just plays into what do you call it? Like the way that there's a counterculture and then there's a counterculture and then that just becomes a market group.
I know. One of my favorite videos I've ever seen was actually somebody who talked about how Alex Jones and other 9/11 truthers were actually part of a bigger conspiracy in order to distract from the real culprits responsible.
Yeah, worlds within worlds.
There was some other group that never came out. Yeah, exactly.
All right. So I'd like to move on from Act 2 to Act 3 in this discussion. We can leave behind Deleuze, unfortunately, and leave behind the high theory aspects of this and try to move into, okay, what is the function of conspiracy theory? Is it right? Is it wrong? How does it affect politics? Does politics even matter anymore? Is all of politics conspiratorial? Just in the sense of, conspire. I mean, I haven't checked this out, but in Latin, it sounds to me like breathing together, probably interpreted as whispering together or something like that. So what is this behind the scenes force? And if we are actually decided, Matt, you weren't here, but we decided last week that we were a leftist podcast. So if we're looking forward, if we're looking forward to dealing with conspiracy theory, what would that look like as a negotiation?
But we're a big tent leftist podcast, aren't we? I mean, I think it's nice to have you here, Matt, because I feel like you and I are both what the rest of them would call just libs.
We are anti-pedophile, though. We're not breaking on that point.
But you guys do welcome left
and
libs.
We don't like anime. No anime here either.
We're open to hentai, though.
Plastic Pills does not endorse this opinion.
But yeah, I was actually thinking about the way in which, in terms of what's happening with the Republican Party in politics right now, like what's interesting is, there's a lot of conspiracy theories emerging, but it's also kind of, and I wonder what Matt thinks about this, that like, I feel like in some ways the alt-right and a certain brand of like conspiracy theories have now like don't really know what to do because like their narratives aren't working anymore in the COVID context. Like I feel like we hear a lot more, or we hear a lot less from like sort of identity based conspiracy thinking. I feel like the alt-right's been like hasn't been very active lately, at least not that I've noticed. Maybe they are just as active, but I feel like there's a way in which now like certain kinds of narratives about what's happening and like that there's like a left-wing conspiracy, like they try to use these, but like the reality of COVID just prevents, like it only allows it to go so far. I don't know.
Yeah, no, I've talked about that before, right? And I think it's too early to talk about whether this is going to undermine figures like Trump or other right-wing forms of conspiracy theorizing. Since I don't want to make those predictions, since I made those kind of predictions back in 2016, saying that Trump wasn't going to be elected, and obviously that's what happened, right? But I do think that the COVID crisis does demonstrate the limits of a postmodern approach to politics, like the one that people like Trump endorse, precisely because death is about as real as it gets for most people.
Exactly.
And you can't talk your way past it. You can't BS your way through it. Because people have a very fundamental and genetic anxiety towards it.
Exactly.
Right?
There's
Now, this doesn't mean people won't attempt to do that. And we see that they try to make all kinds of efforts to do so. But whether the public in general is going to swallow it outside of a small hardcore of Trump supporters, maybe 40% or so, I mean, that's an open question. And we've seen Trump's poll numbers dropping pretty quickly over the last couple of weeks. So it doesn't seem like that's really sticking the way that they would want it to.
Yeah, I mean, it's fascinating the way we've also seen him lately have this kind of double message, this contradictory message. I mean, Trump, where he's, on the one hand, he has guidelines about when states can open up. But then on the other hand, he's saying like liberate whatever state, liberate Michigan. Supporting the protesters there who are kind of saying they want to reopen. And I don't know, when we were having the broader discussion about conspiracy theories, I was kind of like thinking about like because I feel like there's a lot of conspiratorial language that isn't like a full out conspiracy theory on the right, like about that the left kind of wants to keep things closed. And it's not quite a conspiracy theory, but there's like some conspiratorial flirting from like you hear from people like Laura Ingraham on Fox News. And I just feel like there's this kind of like, they don't want us to open. They don't want you to like go back to work. They want to keep you in lockdown for whatever reason, because they want to demonstrate the like, I don't know, social welfare programs or who knows what it is. I don't know.
Yeah, well, I think this is part and parcel of the kind of hyper-masculist dialogue that you see on the political right, particularly the American political right today. And you know how they say the opposite of love isn't hatred, it's indifference, right? Because both of these are strong feelings, right? The opposite of bluster isn't, kind of quiet self-control. It's paranoia, right? And so, the inverse of bluster is paranoia. Right. And I think that's what you're seeing right now, the dialectic between paranoia and bluster on Trump's part, where on the one hand, he wants to present himself and his followers as being strong and assertive, and they're not going to take it, and they're going to fight back against a system that oppresses them, even though Trump is the system now. Yeah. But on the other hand, in order to make that meaningful, there has to be something that they're afraid of. Otherwise, they're just protesting against nothing that's all that threatening. Yeah. So the other side of this is, of course, to present Corona as a very real threat, something that's extremely dangerous, that it's been produced by the USA's mortal enemy to try to undermine them. And this is obviously a contradictory message, right? But it's a necessary dialectic between bluster and paranoia that Trump's been carrying on throughout the course of his presidency. And I don't know if it's still going to work in these kinds of circumstances, precisely because, like, as we were talking about, death is a very real thing that people tend to not be paranoid about. They tend to be genuinely afraid of it, right? With good reason. And whether that's going to undermine his support or the support of other people like him, I don't know, but I certainly hope so. Yeah. Bring on, if we can't have democratic socialism because Bernie Sanders isn't in the race, at least let's have reform liberalism.
I mean, in a way, it's great to have Matthew with us today, considering he is in the sort of left wing, the right wing outreach department of the left. And today the prevailing wisdom of looking at conspiracy theories is that we shouldn't dismiss these people who believe in them as paranoiacs. We shouldn't dismiss them in that way, because that often just drives them into a more hardline belief, right? What I tend to do, and I'm sure what tons of other people to do, is that if I'm arguing with some nut job on the internet, I tend to just dismiss them. I just say, fuck off, buddy. And I don't want anything to do with it. Or I see a conspiracy theory and I know it right away and I give it no credence. But that way of thinking is also the way of thinking that reinforces people's sort of, let's say, maladaptive worldviews. And it's really important to try to reach out to these people, and even before they adopt conspiracy theories, just to say, like anti-vaxxers, right? Like before they become anti-vaxxers, let's give them information about vaccines, or before they become flat earthers, like give them a globe that is filled with whiskey and then they'll see that the world is round and there's liquor inside of it and everything's okay, or something like that, right? Like that's where we need to be. And that's always I think of the Lacanian perspective all the time, because he's always coming up with this idea of paranoiac. That was one of his first sort of big ideas, right? But that comes with the connotations of you're just paranoid, right? You're just believing something that's not true because of some kind of psychological defect. And that's the way you reinforce people's hurtful beliefs, right? That's not the way you actually are supposed to engage with these kinds of people.
Yeah, absolutely. And I mean, I think this demonstrates the need to actually resuscitate but alter the old Nietzschean category of resentment as a kind of political emotion. And I think Wendy Brown's done a good job of this in a recent book, In the Ruins of Neoliberalism, when she kind of talks about how it is that resentment doesn't necessarily have to be resentment of the weak towards the powerful, the way Nietzsche was talking about. Resentment can also be the feeling that people have if they are powerful and they don't want to give up that power and they feel that their entitlement to it is being undermined by people from below, which is exactly what you're seeing happen with the Trump phenomena. And I think this is why people on the left have really struggled with actually addressing these individuals in a way that gets them to change their mind. Because when you constantly tell them, you're powerful, you should give up some of that to create a more equal and harmonious society, it generates these extremely strong feelings of resentment that most of us would say they're not entitled to, since they have a privileged position. But it is resentment nonetheless, right? And talking to them as if they're just paranoid and conspiratorial and they don't really understand what's going on just stokes this kind of attitude, right? And of course, and I'm not exactly sure how to get rid of that, how to move past this.
And of course,
it's a very hard thing.
And of course, one way in which they hear like a leftist talking to them about something like privilege, sometimes in their ears, it sounds like the leftist person is the conspiracy theorist, right? Talking about this, like white privilege is some force in the air that, determines everything. So like that's one of the ways in which I think it can be counterproductive, because the leftists will sound like they're falling into a different brand of conspiracy thinking.
And I don't want to take us backwards, but just because I think based on my channel views, some people actually read Lacan. Lacan's paranoiac is not someone who is paranoid. The Lacanian paranoiac is someone who overdetermines the role of the big other. The big other, of course, doesn't exist. It's part of you. But you overdetermine the view of yourself as if from outside, which is what makes you a paranoiac. And that is not partial to right or left politics in any sense.
Yeah, I had
I'd like to bring
sense
up a potential Lacanian approach that you guys have kind of got me wondering about, especially Eric and Matt. So, Eric, you brought up a couple approaches for how to, talk to people. I mean, education, of course, early on. Now, what separates Lacan apart from a lot of analysts is he does not want to take a part in the discourse. The analyst's position is a little bit like the hysterics.
We lost him. We lost him again.
See, this is the conspiracy theory in action right now, right? The powers that be are preventing.
They're shutting us down
because they know he'll utter
the
such
physical
truth.
Materiality of the big other wishes Alex not to dispense his wisdom.
Absolutely.
Yeah. Does anyone know what he was going to say?
Can you guys hear me?
Yeah, I can hear you now. Yeah.
Yes.
Can you hear me? Okay. Matt brought up how basically in the absence of a big other or God, we have to posit a new one. So do you think we could take an analytic approach to these theorists and constantly ask questions until they realize they are using their imagination so much or leaping into contradiction? Is this position a way that we could actually create dialogue that would, open up to?
I personally don't think so, right? And I mean, one of the reasons is that conservatism is fundamentally a disposition more than it is a thought out theory. It rationalizes various ways of looking at the world in a hierarchical manner after the fact, which is why it's always retrospective, right? And the problem with trying to get somebody who's dispositionally inclined towards certain conservative positions to change, whether because of education or by constantly questioning what they're doing, in my experience at least, and maybe people will find a different one, is then they'll eventually just throw up their hands and say, well, what else am I supposed to believe in then, right? And then if anything, you'll entrench their desire to support these kinds of systems of meaning, if you want, because now not only do they realize that they can latch on to nothing else, but they feel like you're an antagonist who's deliberately trying to separate themselves from something that gave them a great deal of significance in their life. And it's important to politically marginalize you because now you pose a threat, right?
And that's a paranoiac in the most embodied sense of it. They're saying, if you take away these, whatever amorphous values, you must give me a big other, because if you take away my big other, then I have no possible function in the universe. Whereas I think most of us have realized already, who the fuck cares?
No. I mean, they killed Socrates, right? So, I mean, I think that's exactly the point, right? You leave Euthyphro without beliefs in the gods, and then 5 days later, he's going to be casting a stone into a pot saying, let them drink the hemlock, right?
I think it could work, if you have friends, or if you wanted to spend all day on the internet asking more and more and make people realize they don't know as much as they're claiming to. I think it could potentially be a way to, help us, pull out of this kind of thinking, because it is getting a lot of traction. But it would be time consuming. I
think so. And I mean, like, I've convinced a few people to change their minds, and some people have written to me saying like, blah, 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 thank you, blah, 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 which is always nice to hear. And I'm not saying that to kind of brag. I'm just trying to say this is a very, very rare thing, right? And usually
Matt, I think you should brag.
You should brag. If you've changed people's minds, you should.
You're taking shots in the dark.
Okay, but the point that I was trying to get at is this was not, I mean, Alex is right. It was a very long process. And not only is it a very long process, it's an individuated process, right? Like, you have to talk to people like individuals, speak to their interests intelligently, and with some erudition, and then you kind of have to work them through why it is that they don't need to lean on these systems of meaning, but they can, if you want to put it very colloquially, just think for themselves, right? And there's no formula for this, and because there is no formula for it,
well, what if there was a common formula for this? I mean, if this is a goal that we could have societally,
and I would pay you a lot of money, and I'd pay you a lot of money to get it done, because you'd make my life a lot easier. So give it to me.
Yeah, how did it work with Stefan Molyneux?
Yeah, absolutely. Right? He wrote to me afterwards, and he's like, I've become a
Well, Matt recently has a Patreon up, but I think we should support him as the outreach wing.
Yeah.
Because he's saying that I'm going to function as the analyst for the left wing to the right wing, which is something that I have absolutely no patience for at all.
Yeah, it takes monumental patience for that sort of thing.
Yeah, remember when we met that alt-right guy who was from California? Plastic pills on.
Don't talk about that.
Well,
no. Okay. Early in the night. Well, I'll just give you a summary. Early in the night, he threatened to fight me, and if you saw this guy, no, it doesn't matter.
It doesn't matter.
Early in the night, he threatened to fight me, and then later in the night, he was crying on my shoulder after having a few shots of whatever he was drinking, saying, I just wanted a community. That's all I wanted.
Yeah.
I probably should have laughed.
See, it's kind of
he's a young kid. Yeah.
Embrace the schizo.
No, he's the paradigmatic Jordan Peterson Patreon.
He's what we want all conspiracy theorists to be. They'll cry on our shoulder, hopefully.
Here's my last thought. Could we make better leftist conspiracy theories?
Better leftist conspiracy theories.
I'm intrigued. What do you mean?
I'm intrigued by this too.
I'm actually tempted to say that plastic pills has to have some kind of conspiratorial element to it. Because when I first saw your symbol, I was like, what the fuck does that mean?
How can I join?
Yeah.
It's a very Matrix.
Who would want to take a plastic pill anyway?
Yeah.
Well, they're fake. All right. They're not real. False consciousness and ideology critique is a left-wing conspiracy theory. And that's exactly what, well, not exactly, but that's what Agamben was applying to COVID. He had this rough and ready theory and he applied it and it had disastrous results. And he's still writing articles. He just wrote one like a few days ago, didn't he? trying to.
Yeah, I think I linked like a little short thing to you guys a few days ago.
Yeah, and just trying to clarify like why he's stupid or something like that. I didn't actually read it, but false consciousness, when you claim that people are voting against their interests or believing in things that are harmful to them, you just claim that they have false consciousness and that they should be doing something better. They should have some kind of class solidarity. That seems to me like a conspiracy theory, because it just seems to say that there's a ruling class that has this unified set of interests that they're just opposing on everyone underneath them.
Well, no, that was never the point.
Not a conspiracy?
The point was that we take on the beliefs of those we identify with, and you identify with who you want to be or become. So,
but they're identifying with the wrong people. They're identifying with those in power, and they're eating out of their hand when they should be identifying with each other.
Solidarity
mailmen
is
should
the
be with
authentic human
mailmen,
spirit that we're not.
and educators with educators.
That's not the point. That's not the point.
I'm gonna just stand by Eric here for a few seconds and just say that I get what he's saying, right? Too often the left kind of leans on theories of false consciousness to kind of wash away any responsibility for failing to actually mobilize people to support their policies, right? I saw a lot of that after Jeremy Corbyn was defeated. It's not anything that we did because our policies were perfect, our man was perfect. The situation called for left-wing reforms. The reason is, the right-wing machine convinced people to vote against their class interests or whatever it happens to be.
Same with Sanders,
I think that's the kind of, yeah, no, exactly, right? And I think that's the kind of lazy theorizing that we can't use right now, because it's all too easy to say it's not our fault, nothing we do. It's just this gigantic right-wing machine that's always going to bully us into submission by brainwashing our supporters.
But I think it's true in the same way I think conspiracy theories are true. It takes that kernel of truth, right? There's that kernel of truth there, and then there's this apparatus of deception built around it that is untrue or that extends it beyond all sensibility whatsoever.
Well, I think where it's not true is I think it over determines this idea that human beings want to have solidarity, and maybe is ignoring the truth that there is something in human being that wants to look to authority, or there's at least a temptation in human beings to look towards authority, and that's maybe inconvenient truth for leftist solidarity
it's about
dreams.
Looking to the person who seems like they're getting everything they desire and identifying with that. I want to remind you when Marx was the one who brought up this idea from the very beginning, that, the proletariat is identifying with the beliefs of the bourgeoisie. It's not just about party politics. It's about all the people going out and buying things who are broke and can't afford it, but buy it just so they don't look poor. It's because they think they're going to get the objects of their desire if they buy the commodity fetishes. So it's not just about, identifying with authority. It's about saying that's someone who's getting what they want. How can I be that, or at least look like that? So it's about, desire, class, and, it's not just about taking on beliefs because we were told to.
I mean, it's not all about that, because celebrities are the people who get everything they want, and they've got to be fucking careful right now, because people if they complain about what they have to do for COVID, right, people are going to shit all over them. Look at that video that came out recently, and they were all singing Imagine All the People, and they got shit on because they are completely disconnected with the average person's struggle in this situation. They get everything they want, but we don't want them to get whatever they want if they're going to be these disconnected tools.
Yet we wish we were them.
Well, I can tell this is going to be a bitch to edit.
Yeah, I'm 3 beers deep now. I'm running in all directions.
So we've discussed this from several different dimensions and dealt with, what people are, what people think they are, what people wish they were, all as part of conspiracy theory. And it's really all connected.
I would like to actually point out that I came here for conspiratorial reasons. And part of it was to talk about my book that's released tomorrow. Okay. I just thought it'd be funny to do that.
No,
I thought it would be too.
We're gonna get to that at the end. I mean the rest of you, and then we're gonna go. I'm gonna introduce Matt and give him his.
I'll second Matt's book.
Plug zone.
No, I got nothing. I don't know.
All right. I will just come out to say then that I think conspiracy theories are insanely creative and they're fun just because they're
so much better to be creative and right about stuff than it is to just be creative and wrong about everything, though. Isn't that better?
Can't you write fiction? Well, that is what you're doing.
Picking up on Plastic Pills' point, I would say that I think like maybe one thing we haven't really like acknowledged is just that, well, yes, conspiracy theories provide this kind of sense of security, maybe like a kind of ontological stability or like in over determining reality. But then like just picking up on what Plastic Pills is saying, like it's true that they're just also just the fact that they're more fun and that like non-conspiracy theories are boring. And it's like, maybe that's one part of it that is maybe not an insignificant reason for their appeal.
Reality is boring.
Mm-hmm.
This is actually one thing that I was really disappointed by because I felt like we should have talked about Philip K. Dick, since pretty much all of his novels are precisely about all these themes. Big conspiracies entrapping the little man who's concerned about whether God exists and whether he's real and so on. And never once did his name come up.
Why didn't you bring it up till now?
I was going to, but then my computer fucked up. Okay, the powers that be interfere with me also, just like they interfere with Alex.
Yeah.
I don't know. Powers that be, I'll figure it out.
This is very Lovecraftian too. You could talk about that too. Dick, Lovecraft, the fringe Bernie bros probably have some theories about the powers that were working against Sanders. They're
exactly.
conspiracy theories, whether or not they're true.
Yeah, and aren't there?
And not all conspiracy theories aren't true. Some of them are right.
Say, it's a matter of time.
All right, so we have covered a lot of ground here. It was organic. I really actually liked what we did here. Do you guys like that? Just like giving a topic and then
I enjoyed it.
Kind of bouncing off each other. I think that's a good policy. Anyways, I want to thank our guest, Matt McManus, refugee from Mexico. You can find him on Twitter at Matt Polprof. He also has 2 books out, and there's something new coming out. Matt, what is that?
So our book Myth and Mayhem: A Leftist Critique of Jordan Peterson is out tomorrow. It is written by me, Marion Trejo, Conrad Hamilton, Ben Burgess, and Zizek introduces the book. So
we can't say tomorrow because who knows when this is going to be done.
Yeah, say the date.
It's being released April 24th.
And Matt also has a Patreon. How do you, no, I was like, that was a question. It was a poorly phrased question.
If you like what I'm doing, if you like what you're doing, you can read any of my articles on outlets like Ariel, Marion West, or Art Digital. And I also have a Patreon page set up that has some exclusive content that people might want to see.
And you can always yell at them on Facebook.
Absolutely.
Do you have a lot of Patreon supporters, Matt? I'm curious.
I got a few. Like I have 7 now, and I'm making $40 a month, and that was in a day. Woo! So I'm relatively happy with that.
It's not bad.
It means I can buy like beer for one night. But
hey, can't complain about that.
Yeah, there you go.
So Matt is a friend of the show. Definitely going to come on again at some point.
Hopefully.
Oh yeah.
Do it.
I don't know. This is just going to be a mess to edit because I don't know what parts are narrative. I don't want to bring in Matt's Patreon viewers as part of it.
Why not?
Maybe we'll paywall some. We could paywall some of this and make some money.
Yeah, we can be like, find out about Matt's Patreon supporters and the
paywall it halfway through.
By the way, I was going to ask another question.
We'll put on the bit about Matt's Patreon, and after that, all right. So the last thing we have to do, everybody gets to say one word before we shut this down.
What?
And we're going to start with Matt, whose Patreon we're supporting.
D'Souza.
All right, politics guy.
Power structure. I guess that's 2 words. I don't know. This is stupid. Why is this?
Aggression.
Semiotics.
And since I'm the host, I don't have to say anything. So this is Plastic Pills. Thanks for listening.
That's bullshit.
Take care of yourselves. Don't breathe in COVID.
Suck a tailpipe.
All right.
Freeze it out.
That's a wrap. Stop recording.
I'm going to stop
All right,
recording.
I'm turning it off.
That's good advice.